Hey everyone, this is Scott Rick from History Unplugged. We have a special session that we're doing, and this is a Q&A with author Faris Cassell, who is the author of the new book, The Unanswered Letter. If you don't know about the book, I'll just describe it very briefly, and then we'll get into it, because it's a really fascinating subject. So it all starts with a man named Alfred Berger, who in 1939, he writes a letter to somebody he doesn't know in America. He's never met this person. He has nothing in common with them except that they share the last name. That's because he was part of a Jewish family in Vienna, excuse me, who couldn't flee Nazi Germany. They had found escape routes for his daughter, he and his wife, but their money, their connections, all their options of being able to flee had run out. So the letter starts with this opening line to the American recipient. You're surely informed about the situation of all Jews in Central Europe. By pure chance, I got your address. My daughter and her husband will go to America. Help us to follow our children. It is our last and only hope. And this all began, Faris, when you found this original letter, and it began this enormous research journey where you're uncovering all these other documents to find out what happened to Alfred, what happened to his family, and everyone else. So let's start with the beginning. Always a great place to start. How did you come across this letter?
Yeah, well, it actually walked in my back door, in a manner of speaking, and almost literally. Um, my husband is a physician, and he had a longtime patient who gave it to him one day, and said, "I think this is a piece of history, and perhaps you'll know what to do with it better than I do." So he brought it home and showed it to me, and I was, really just taken aback. I was so deeply moved by the letter, begging for help to escape what we now know. It was dated August of 1939. The Nazis were just a week away practically from invading and occupying Poland. They had already occupied Austria. So these people were writing from Vienna, Germany, as they marked on the letter, and they were writing, begging for help. But what we know was the beginning of a Holocaust, and I wanted to know. It just seemed that the questions were rising up out of this letter. Who, did the American family help? Did Alfred and Hedwig immigrate to the United States? And did they survive? And the questions just, they just grabbed hold of my heart, and I wanted to know what happened. So, a decade later, I finally had the answer put together.
And I'm really curious what it was like to meet this family in Los Angeles who received the letter. They saved it for 2 generations. They saved it for 60 years. That is a long time to hold on to something. If you didn't care about it, it would be thrown out at some point with old tax returns.
Yeah.
Why did they keep it? And also, when you met with them, what was their emotional attachment to this letter? What did it feel like to them from what you could tell?
Okay. So, it was the great niece of the family who had originally received the letter in 1939. And she had an interesting attachment to the letter. When I interviewed her and tried to find out what her aunt and uncle had done about the letter, she first told me, well, they responded to it. They had written back and didn't hear anything. And then later she told me, well, she doesn't think they really did answer. So she was a little bit sorry, I think, that her family hadn't done more, and she didn't really want to think about that. But what that family did do was save the letter. They knew that it was important, and they knew that that it had moved them. And she saved it because she said, well, it's a piece of history. But as I talked to her more, she kept saying, well, what happened? What happened to those people? I hope you will find out. I realized that as the letter had moved me, it had touched her heart and the family's heart. So I think they saved it as a piece of history, but also because they were so deeply moved by this plea.
Hmm. And you also were locating other people connected to the Bergers, including the Bergers' granddaughter in America, Celia Cizes, if I have the pronunciation right.
Yes.
So, how did you locate her, and what is her recollection of what happened to her family?
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting story, and it has to do with the way the internet used to work.
Hmm.
When I began this, the internet was a lot more open, and Celia has an unusual last name, Sizes, and so I could just Google that name, her name, and there aren't many Sizeses in America. There just aren't that many, and so I tried to contact each one of the names that came up. And I saw that one was in New York City, and I thought, well, if there's one and only one in New York at that time. She has since moved, but I thought, well, New York is where if the daughter would have landed if she truly had made it. So um, I could find the phone number easily on the internet in those days, and and the address. So I wrote Celia and explained that I'd gotten this letter and I thought her grandfather probably had written it. Um, and I phoned her. And for a month, I got no response, but I called that number every day, figuring that if somebody had kept this number, if that number was still active, which it was, then it belonged to somebody and they would eventually answer it. And so finally, after a month of calling and writing and explaining that I had this letter and I thought it was from her grandfather, she did call me. She did call me with great trepidation and maybe suspicion about talking to a stranger. But eventually, as we talked more, as I sent her a copy of the letter, she just was hungry to find out more. She really wanted to know the story behind the letter. She had known a little bit about her grandparents. She had heard stories from her parents, who did reach America, but the stories she had were like family stories, and family stories, can change over the years. So she knew a little bit, and so as I began to research and learn more and more, um, looking around the internet, I searched archives really in a number of countries all over the world, and put together a timeline, a chronology of her own family, what happened there. And so she was, she was just so thankful and so helpful along the way, to learn what had happened to her own family.
Well, as you're talking to relatives and as you're doing your own research, you go to Vienna, you look at the Bergers' old haunts, you even talk to a former member of the Hitler Youth. As the story begins to fill out and you learn the details, could you describe what happened from when Alfred sent that letter to America in 1939 for the next few years? What happened to the members of the family?
Oh, wow. Yeah,
Hmm.
a lot happened to them. They had already been living under the Nazis for a little over a year. And a step at a time, sometimes big steps, sometimes little steps. The Nazis persecuted more and more severely the Jewish people there. So Alfred and Hedwig, Alfred, by the way, had an eye condition, and he was going progressively blind, so he could not see well, and he had this disability which was recognized by the city. He had filed in some way a disability, so he had a little tiny bit of protection as the Nazis and Viennese citizens took over Jews' apartments and businesses. So his business just disappeared. He was in the textile business, and he had wholesale textiles that he sold really across Europe and throughout Vienna. And his business disappeared, taken over by the Nazis. And but he would manage to stay in the same apartment from 1939 till 1941, maybe 1940 it was, 1940. I don't know how he was, how his apartment was confiscated, how it was taken from him. First, other Jews whose apartments were taken, and they were forced out of their own places, had to find new places to live. So those Jews, homeless Jews, came to live with other Jewish families. And so Alfred and Hedwig Berger had to take in other Jews. So their apartment was getting more and more crowded. And then eventually they lost their apartment, and they all had to move in to someone else's apartment. And so that happened several times till they were pushed into what was becoming like a Jewish ghetto. There was no barbed wire in around ghettos in Vienna, as there were in cities in Poland, for instance. But they were moved closer and closer to a railroad station, where eventually they would be rounded up, and the plan was for them both to be deported. Alfred and his wife Hedwig deported to Minsk in what is now Belarus. Then it was the Soviet Union.
And can you talk about the Berger's daughter and son-in-law's deportation to Poland? And this is also a link to Kristallnacht.
Oh yes, that was really a very dramatic, intense time for the Berger family. The Berger's daughter Martha had married a Polish Jew who had come to Vienna illegally, along with thousands of other Polish Jews, came to Vienna, the sparkling, cultural center of Europe, really, at the turn of the century. And Hitler, of course, despised having these Polish Jews in Germany. So they were rounding these illegals. They were rounding up these illegals. And so they rounded up Martha and her husband Leo, and imprisoned them in Vienna, and then deported them on a train along with probably thousands of other illegals across the German Reich. And so all of a sudden, all of these trains were headed to the Polish border, and Poland was not ready to take all these thousands of penniless, basically refugees who may or may not even speak the language. They could have been in the Reich for generations. And so Poland slammed shut its borders, and all these trainloads of people who were just ripped out of their homes with no belongings these train loads were stuck out of just in a no man's land that exists between the German and Polish borders. And Martha and Leo were young and resourceful, and they found a way to escape out of the train car as it crossed, as it neared some border, and I'm not sure just where that was, but they found a way to escape. They ran through the station, found somehow, they hid, they found a way back to Vienna. They found a train back to Vienna. And as the train they found was approaching and rolling into Vienna, they looked out the windows and they saw the city in flames. They saw smoke rising, flames rising everywhere. That was the beginning of Kristallnacht. That was when the Nazis were, a violent episode had occurred in a German embassy while those trains were held in the no man's land. A young nephew of one of the trapped Jews in the train had shot a German diplomat and killed him. And in retribution, a long, secretly planned riot, the Nazis just unleashed this riot that they had planned for a long time to destroy all the Jewish synagogues across Germany and Austria, German businesses, and they confiscated a lot of Jewish apartments also, and murdered Jews. So there was this violent riot when Martha and Leo arrived back. Alfred and Hedwig were in tears. They didn't know what had happened to their daughter and son-in-law, who they knew were just deported and taken away. So the reunion must have been just, full of tears and joy at the same time.
Something that fascinated me about this story with the Berger family was an unknown plot to assassinate Hitler. And
yes,
this is one of those moments where you hear it and you think, had this gone just a little bit differently, it could have altered the course of history. What happened there?
That's exactly right. It's when I first heard it, I thought, I can't believe I'm even hearing this, and that it hasn't been written about before, but it hasn't ever been talked about or known about. A young nephew of Alfred Bergers, whose name was Ernst, decided not to go into what was the family business at that time, which was the textiles. He wanted it at age 18. He wanted to go into the Austrian army, and so he did. He became a sniper in that army, and he had joined in the fall of 1937, and was sent with the Austrian army just to guard the border, because, by the way, Germany was threatening Austria, and the relationships were very tense. So then in March of 38, when the Germans did invade, the Austrian president told the army to stand down. They did not want the carnage that could occur. And the Austrians knew that they didn't have the military power to defend themselves from Germans' powerful and modern army. So the German president had told the army stand down, and it withdrew to Vienna. And so there was Ernst, and this army, the Austrian army, which had been a proud defender of the country, was all of a sudden subject to a brand new commander, Hitler. And there were lots of mixed feelings. The army, in the rush of this occupation, was assigned to actually defend Hitler and protect him. And they were assigned to guard the parade route where Hitler would enter Vienna in this triumphant motorcade. So, so Ernst was stationed along with others at the windows of a building overlooking the parade route. In the room with him were army officers. He was just a young sniper. And as the motorcade approached and Hitler approached the street where underneath Ernst's window, the officers all left that room. It's not written about really much at all how the loyalty transferred of the Austrian army to become the part of the German army. And mixed feelings. They left the room knowing that Ernst was a sharpshooter and Jewish. And so there was Ernst left alone in the room with his, I don't know, rifle, I suppose, aimed right at Hitler. So the motorcade passed, and the family story has come down that Ernst sat there with stood there with his hand, his finger on the trigger, and debated what to do, and decided in the end that he couldn't just assassinate Hitler. He felt like the repercussions for Jews would be horrendous, and not, of course, in those days they didn't understand, the magnitude of the horror that was to come. But that was his decision in the moment, and so Hitler passed, and the moment passed.
Well, the story of Jews in Europe, we always associate it with the Holocaust and genocide, but that isn't the case for everyone because some are able to successfully flee. And in this conversation with the Berger family, excuse me, we have the husband and wife, Alfred and Hedwig, and then the daughter Martha and the son-in-law Leo. Was it Leo who just had an incredibly circuitous route trying to come to America? Is that right?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, can you tell me about that? I mean, I can't believe how many roadblocks he had getting there.
Yes. Well, because, as I've said, he was an illegal immigrant. The Nazis were hunting for all of these illegals, and were deporting them, imprisoning them, and their fates were really uncertain. So Leo was sleeping on park benches. He was hiding. And the family knew that it was so important to get him out first. So one strategy that Jews used who weren't able to just immigrate quickly to another country was to buy a ticket to Cuba. There, Jews would wait for an opportunity to immigrate legally to America. And Cuba was glad to do this because it involved a lot of money. And so there was a lot of graft in the political system, and they were glad to get these high-priced, they charged a lot of taxes in Havana. So Leo had relatives in America who were applying for a visa, but his visa number hadn't come up yet. His quota number was not high enough, so he was on the route to being a legal American immigrant, but his turn wasn't up yet. So the plan was for him to wait in Havana for his turn to come up. But his ship reached the Havana harbor and was stopped there, along with another ship called the SS St. Louis, which is a famous story. A movie has the Voyage of the Damned was a movie about that ship, but Leo's ship, the Flounder, also was in the harbor, and there was a big argument with the Cuban government, who was all of a sudden demanding more money. And no one could pay it, and so these ships were just held there, not allowed to dock. Eventually, Leo's ship was returned, luckily to France, where Leo had boarded, and not to Germany, where he would have been imprisoned. He stayed in France. The French were worried about Germans possibly invading France. The Germans were aggressive all over Europe at that point, and so the Germans wouldn't let these returned passengers just free and loose around their country. These were some of them. A lot of these Jews were German nationals. They were like Leo, residents of Austria. So they imprisoned Leo, and he stayed in various prisons for 2 years. First, he was in the north of France in work camps, and then his group of prisoners was attached to a unit of the French army, which was sent north to defend France from the possible invasion by Germany. When that invasion did happen in the spring of 40, Leo's unit turned and was being overrun and overwhelmed immediately. It was not a long fight. It was an instant retreat. Leo ran, literally, the French army ran from the north of France to the south. There were some trains, but the whole of France, the whole of the northern countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, citizens were just running in the highways. There were cars, there were, bicycles, there were people pushing baby carriages, and Leo was among the hordes of people running south. He made it with the army to Marseille, and there he was trying to find a way out and get his visa and all his papers put in order so he could leave. That was far more difficult than it ever had been. America was experiencing a crush of refugees trying to get into it, into the country, and Leo's visa number hadn't come up yet. Plus, a lot of his papers had expired. So he hid for 2 years while he was waiting to find transportation and for his papers to be approved. At the time, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the State Department, and they were impeding a lot of the legal Jewish immigrants. So he hid in haystacks, and finally, the end of a train line up in the Pyrenees, right against the Spanish border. So he finally was able to get his papers approved by a famous U.S. diplomat whose name is Hiram Bingham, who had taken pity on all these Jews with legal right to immigrate that were being held back, and he approved Leo's visa. Really, on the last day that Hiram Bingham was in France, before the State Department realized what he was doing, and they transferred him out of France. But that was Leo's great lightning bolt of good fortune that he was, got his papers on that last possible day.
And something you do in your book is have to make an educated guess about what happens to people. And for those who read history books, they don't realize how much of history writing that is, since when you get far enough in the past, we don't have a detailed account that gives us clear instances and lets us know exactly what happened. Sometimes we just have to do our best with limited information. And I believe you had to do that with Alfred and Hedwig, the mother and father. What was their fate as far as you could tell?
Well, actually, I know quite a lot. I was doing a lot of guessing, and there were just huge blanks in the story. Um, and then I discovered a trove of letters that Alfred and Hedwig had written to their daughter Martha and her husband Leo in America. And so I learned a lot about their experience as they were pushed from one apartment to the next. And also, by the way, among the best record keepers ever in the world were the Nazis. The Gestapo kept really good records, and there are big archives of them now in Germany too. Um, Alfred and Hedwig were slated for deportation in the spring of 1942. America was already at war with Germany then, and so there was communication had been cut off with there was no mail anymore to America, to and from America. But Alfred and Hedwig were scheduled to be deported. A week before that happened, Alfred was walking in the neighborhood where he and Hedwig had been forced to live, and was crossing a street and was struck down by a German army truck. It was a cold and foggy day, so who knows what really happened. He would have had his yellow star on his coat, and perhaps the army vehicle saw that and aimed for it and didn't care, about this old Jew crossing the road. Perhaps it was an accident, but in any case, he was killed on the street. I know that because of family stories that came down from another Jew who did survive the war and who saw Alfred on the street where he died.
Well, what I'm curious of, yes, go ahead.
And then Hedwig lived through that horrible accidental death of her husband, unexpected death. And then she, the next week, was deported to Minsk. It was one of the first deportations to Minsk. Others had gone to other places before. And she was deported along with 1,000 other men, women, and children on really a train journey from hell. It was stopped along the way so that the soldiers in Minsk could celebrate a holiday, a religious holiday, and I think it's called Whit Sunday. And their train was just held for a number of days on a siding with almost no food, no sanitation, and the train had to change. They had to change from a regular train car to a cattle car at the Russian border, and even just that changing of the train was so cruel. People were beaten in the middle of the night to make them hurry up and to load them into the cattle car. So this woman alone just experienced incredible brutality before she reached Minsk, where all these thousand people were loaded onto trucks, taken to a site at the edge of the city, and they were all shot and killed.
And I understand at this point, when you were looking at this family's history, you saw that it had connection with your own family history and it intersected with your family's Holocaust story. What was that?
Yes, that was actually really a startling revelation. When I was researching Hedwig's fate and saw exactly where Minsk was, I looked on the map, and nearby was a little town called Radoshkovichi, which is, I'd heard from my husband where his family had come from. Several generations earlier, at the turn of the century, his grandfather had immigrated from this tiny little town. And so my husband and I went to that town. In Belarus, it's a very autocratic communist government still, and you couldn't travel freely in Belarus. You needed to, submit a real detailed description of what you wanted to do, and you were assigned a guide. You couldn't just go where you wanted to go. So with this guide, Sydney and I went to Radishkovici, and as we walked around, we engaged in a conversation with a local resident who knew the story of what happened to the Jews under the Nazis. My husband's family had never known. Their family had just disappeared during World War II, is all that they ever knew. And this resident told us that one day Nazis just marched into the town, rounded up the Jews, herded them into a barn, locked them in, and burned them all to death. So that was the place where the two stories of Alfred and Berger, and then my husband's family, where those two stories just seemed to merge and come together in a tragic way.
Well, there are millions of stories like this when it comes to the Jewish experience in World War II and the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And the Bergers are interesting. They're a lower class family. They aren't from an elite background that would seem to get more of the focus of family and character profiles of the Holocaust. So for them, why do you think looking into their story and writing your book and giving it to audiences today is important?
Yeah. Well, yes. Actually, early on when I started writing this book, I was speaking with a newspaper journalist about this letter that I had received, and I was this newspaper journalist had written a number of stories about the Holocaust, and so he asked me as I was telling him about this, and he said, "Well, were Alfred and Hedwig important?" And the question just kind of took me by surprise, and I said, kind of, huh? What do you mean? And he said, were they famous? And in the moment, I just kind of said, no, they weren't important, they weren't famous. And so, he thanked me for my call and hung up. But the question really bothered me afterwards. It really sank in what I had said and what he had asked. He was asking a journalist's question, and that was quite reasonable. But the fact is that, yes, Alfred and Hedwig were important. They were people like they were ordinary people, like I am, and like perhaps you are. We're important in certain ways to our families, but we're ordinary people, and so truly is everyone. I believe everyone is important, whether their jobs are high paid or low paid, or whether they're in the news a lot or not. Every life is important and needs to be valued and respected. And that's what happened during the Holocaust. Hitler dehumanized people and convinced a huge number of people in the world that these people were not important, not really even human. They were called vermin, and there was so much mind control happening that this one question, were they important, sort of unleashed all of that for me. And yes, Alfred and Hedwig were important
Hmm.
because they were human like us all.
Well, there's a lot more to unpack in this book, and there's a lot more stories about this family and also the world around them. And the book is The Unanswered Letter, One Holocaust Family's Desperate Plea for Help. And I understand the book is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all those places.
Yes. Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for joining us, Faris, and for this sit-down Q&A. And I encourage listeners and viewers to check out the book.
Thank you, Scott.